Chapter 1 of business law, and I'll try to break this up maybe into a couple of different segments. So normally I've kind of done a lecture over the whole thing, but the gurus tell me that it's better to try to shorten these and maybe just allow you guys, 8 or 10 minutes maybe, and then get on to the next one. So here we go. Just a reminder there, the BPA chapter, which is the Business Professionals of America chapter. We do have a chapter on campus. It's relatively new, although last year we had 5 members go to the national competition. Of the 5, they all brought back awards where they placed in the top 3, and at least 3 of them, I believe, won national championships. So it's a cool deal. Great for your resume, great for your future, so you might want to consider that. I talked briefly when I talked about assignments, but please trying to do those in Word or convert them to Word before you submit them. Sometimes I have problems opening up some of the other formats. A PDF works fine, though. If you've got a PDF option, that's fine too. And some of the other ones might work, but if you submit it in another format, don't be surprised if you get an email back from me that says, "Oh, this doesn't work." So. Quality of assignments, what do I mean by that? And I didn't talk about that earlier, is that I fully expect everybody to have proper spelling, proper grammar, those types of things. I will discount. Okay, I will discount for those types of mistakes. I probably occasionally let the occasional typo go without a discount, but especially if I see a constant misuse of words or grammar or those types of things, I will discount for those. I do like a little humor every now and then. U.S. is a nation of law. John Adams said that, of course, one of our founding fathers. And what does that mean? Well, as opposed to other nations, perhaps, we're a nation that has set up laws, the supreme law being the Constitution, right? We don't have a supreme leader like North Korea. We have a supreme law, which is the Constitution, and things are based on that. And so, no matter how wild and crazy our politicians get, they're supposed to do it within the law. And of course, we could argue about present and past administrations whether or not they do that, but for the most part, it's true, okay? And we, one of the things that's going on right now, President Trump is trying to maybe put some limits on immigration, and several judges have stepped up and said that may not be according to law, okay? And so they're going to fight it out, and the courts are going to have to make some decisions about that. It may ultimately probably will go to the Supreme Court for a final decision on that. And that's what's important, okay? We've got 3 branches, and there's the checks and balances, and we talk about those later. But it's really, really important that in the U.S., and you'll hear that often, that we are a nation of laws, and that's what that means, that we have a supreme constitution, not a supreme leader. Law, the rule of law and property, definitely provide a necessary foundation for successful modern business. The U.S. has, over the last couple hundred years, has by far been the most prosperous nation in the world. And yes, we're blessed with some natural resources and other things, but one of the main reasons, absolutely one of the main reasons, is the fact that we've set up a framework, we've set up rules that people know and understand and they can operate in. You can't have a basketball game without rules, and you can't have a football game without rules, and you can't have successful financial or economic growth without having a set of rules that are enforced. Okay, so we've got rules of contracts, we've got zoning rules, and we've got things like that allow businesses to grow and thrive, okay, in the U.S. because they can have confidence in things are going to be enforced that need to be enforced. Some of the objectives, some of these were kind of covered basically in your homework, I think, so kind of along. So law, or the rules of society, right? They're created by the state. By state, we don't mean Montana. We mean state or nation state. Could be state and could also be local areas, right? And they are enforced to create confidence, like we talked about. Talk about stare decisis a little bit. Not a whole lot. Why nations are weak or strong? Oops, I got ahead of myself there, so hang on a second. Now I'm going to pause for a second here. So, why nations are weak or strong, and it kind of goes through this in the text. I won't spend a lot of time, but the dependency theory basically says that maybe richer nations exploit poorer nations by trade, receiving goods and services maybe from some of those poorer nations. This has kind of been debunked. I mean, most of our trade is with other rich nations. For example, our greatest trade partner is Canada, okay, which is a wealthy nation on a per capita basis, certainly. Mexico, too, which is relatively wealthy compared to other nations around the world. Natural resources exploitation, and to a certain degree, this is, of course, true. I mean, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, some of those nations, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, those are wealthy nations because they have oil resources, and there are other nations. Canada has a certain amount of great natural resources that makes it relatively wealthy. But there's nations that have relatively few, like Singapore, like Japan, and some others that have relatively few resources that are also wealthy. And so it doesn't explain for sure, why those things or it doesn't explain for sure why a country is or is not wealthy. Education and technology kind of leads to, developed nations or nations that are prosperous tend to have good education and good technology. Climate, not so much, right? You have nations, again, like Singapore that are hot and yet are still very wealthy, and nations like Sweden, Finland that are cold and yet are very wealthy nations, or Norway. Of course, Norway has some natural resources too. But a modern private market, there's no getting around that. In fact, on campus here, Jim Edwards has written a book about, I think it's called Painful Birth, about Chile and South America, one of the more prosperous nations in South America, and it's because in the last 30 years they've turned to become a very private market-oriented system, and it's been very, very successful for them. The law and the legal system, again, having a good rule of law has been extremely important for any type of development, any type of economic prosperity. So the rule of law says that laws are made generally and equally applicable. Means that we're not making laws then that are specific, maybe as to race, right? Or we're not making laws that are specific as to religion, or maybe some of those other things, right? And they're equally applicable. Kind of the statement, no one is above the law, right? We apply these to everyone. If you're in North Korea and, if you're in good and you're related to the supreme dictator there, you're probably in good shape. If you get sideways with him, he's going to shoot you or blow you up or something. And we don't have those types of systems here in the U.S., right? So laws rule, right? These are things that help to hold a society together. Some societies are very much religion-based. Nations are based on religions. Again, you might see that in the Middle East. You might see that a little further east to Indonesia, possibly India, those types of things where the religious beliefs are a part of their government, right? Whereas we've tried to build a separation. Their customs, economics, certainly, things things that help, but law is kind of an overriding feature, at least in nations that are free and, again, economically prosperous. Law seems to be really important, okay? So enforcement, without adequate enforcement, the certainty and trust, right? We can't enter into, who would enter into a contract if you weren't sure that you could enforce it, or at least reasonably sure that you could enforce it? And in the U.S. we are, okay? We're reasonably sure that we can enforce contracts because we have a government that says you can, and we have laws. I shouldn't say we have a government. We have laws that say you can, and a government that stands behind those laws, right, to allow us to do that. There you go. Almost all wealthy countries embrace the rule of law. I would say the exceptions to that are maybe some of those nations that are resource rich, maybe some of the oil nations and whatnot that may not have the same rule of law. What is the rule of law? Right? That laws are made generally and equally applicable. Were you impacted by the law on the way to class today? Say yes, right? Everything we do is impacted by the law, and fortunately 99.9% of the things we do happen within the law, and so we just go about our business without interruptions and without a lot of negative things happening or things to even throw us off stride. We go out for dinner, we pay for our dinner, a contract has happened, and it happened fine, and nobody cared. Okay, we all cared, I guess, but it happened fine, and so there weren't any worries as a result. So rule of law in nations, they adopt laws supporting the private marketplace. Okay? And again, those are the nations that have been more successful. We're seeing China grow in prosperity. One of the main reasons is that they're moving more and more towards the private marketplace from the old communist marketplace that they were. They were strictly communistic 30 or 40 years ago, but they're moving more and more towards private marketplace. Law applies to lawmakers as well as the rest of the society. For the most part, our Congress famously exempts itself from a number of laws. Probably the most recent that was well known is exemption from Obamacare. They exempted themselves from that, and so they do that, and that's I know a controversy, I think, for a lot of us. Yeah. It would be in everybody's interest. Yeah, let's pause here, let's stop here, and we'll get talking about property in a separate video.